Summers in the marshlands were accompanied with a scent that hung thick in the air, like sheets drying under the orange sky. It remained long after the last cicada of the season had erupted from its crunchy shell, finding fleeting freedom until its new life was ended abruptly by the beaks of the summer birds. It was the smell of baked algae and sun-ripened reeds that swayed in the fermented water as the creatures mated frantically between their stems. The days were longer then, stretching out into the night as the sun sat stubbornly on the horizon, refusing to relent. My skin, sticky with sweat, begged for the reprieve that came only in the cool air darkness. If the day was for scent, then the night was sound. When evening descended, so too did the roar of cicadas and frog song. So thunderous and unyielding, I would glare into the darkness, convinced the squeal of wings would drive me mad. Those nights, my body would collapse into dreamless, exhausted slumber that only I ever found as a child, yet I would awaken unrefreshed, dark circles under my eyes, and a faint buzzing echo in my ears, the reminder of torture endured. My grandfather, who had spent his whole life in the house that overlooked the wetlands, would sit on the porch at night, treating the sounds like a lullaby. He would grin at me over his morning tea and cackle when I merely grunted in reply to the daily question, how did I sleep? In winter, he longed to hear that horrible noise I so detested. I could never admit to him that in the cold months in suburbia, I sometimes found myself leaning my head on my hands and hoping the seasons would change quickly, that I might be listening to the night sounds sooner. I would never tell him, although I think he always knew. I was 15 the summer that the cicadas stopped singing. I had left my grandfather asleep in his chair. That night was sticky, and I had fallen asleep with my legs twisted around the bedsheet in a pretzel knot. Unsure what had woken me, I sluggishly opened my eyes, dragging myself out of unconsciousness and slowly becoming aware that something was wrong. I sat up in the darkness and rubbed my eyes as they adjusted to the moonlight casting soft shadows around the room, kept bare, save for the bed, a chest of drawers, and a small bedside table with a lamp that was left unplugged throughout the year until my annual summer visit. I searched for the light switch, pausing as I realized the night was quiet. I held my breath, unsure what to make of the silence that blanketed the marsh. There was no sound, no fluttering of a cicada squeal, not one frog burp. The crickets were mute, and not even the zip of a mosquito wing broke the air. Like me, the creatures of the night were silent, though I doubted the reason for their stolen voices was akin to mine. Pulse thundering in my ears, I peered out the window. Under the star-dotted sky, the marsh was slick and shimmering like spilled oil. I pressed my nose against the fly screen as I watched, as if the silence was something I could see. I let the air leak out of my chest with a tiny puff, careful to inhale as quietly as possible. I wondered if I should wake my grandfather and turned back to the bedside table to reach for the lamp when, startled, I stopped. There was a shadow standing in my doorway. It was the size and shape of a man with two piercing silver eyes that stared at me from within its darkness. It was not of this world. As I tried to make sense of it, the static air dancing on my skin made my hair stand. This was not a dream. Its stare, sending chills throughout my body, I waited for movement, for noise, any sign that I was in danger. My pulse rapidly firing as I waited for the shadow creature to reach out and take me into its darkness. Silently, we beheld each other, for only seconds that seemed like hours, until with as little reason as it had appeared, it slowly began to recede into the hall, folding itself into the shadows that belonged in the house. Air escaped my throat in a clumsy, gasping croak as I watched the shadow disappear. The floorboards, which usually creaked with the slightest pressure, were silent. Not a scrape, nor a squeak, and as the realization that I was alone assembled itself in my mind, the night erupted with a roar, and I screamed into my sweat-covered hands as the marsh creatures taunted each other with their croaking and squawking. I waited for my grandfather to appear, expecting my scream to have woken him, but his ears were desensitized to the noisy night, and the pathetic squawk that escaped my throat barely rose above the frog song. I pulled the twisted sheet to my chest and stared at the empty doorway. I sat frozen on the bed for the remainder of the night, with my hands pressed to my face, waiting for the scent of the morning to waft through the window, too frightened to move. By the time the sun peeked over the faraway hills, I was so tired that I had almost forgotten why I could not move, what it was that had occurred, that had made me so scared, hoping my grandfather would knock at the open door. His eyes large with concern as he asked if I was all right. He told me, just as he had when I was a child, that ghosts are simply shadows of our past, lingering in our periphery, occasionally darting into view to remind us that they are there. I could not find the words to tell him that he had been wrong. Sometimes they came out of the shadows to stand in plain view. That morning, I finally picked up the phone and called my mother to tell her my grandfather was dead. I had found him asleep in his chair on the porch overlooking the marsh, and he would not wake up. The words tumbled out of my mouth into the phone receiver like an avalanche. I explained to her how he had appeared to me, that he spoke to me and comforted me. I told her I'd been happy deluding myself that he was still alive, until I awoke in the night to find death standing in my room. I wonder now still, when I see those who have passed, and even when my grandfather visits, if this gift came to me with the summer of my youth. But when I see shadows, I hear the shriek of cicadas echoing in the night, and wonder instead if I am cursed.